David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and at Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. So, just a few questions to work our way through this. Is this the first time that David has been anointed king in the story that we've... Is this the first time? Not the first time, is it? It's actually the third time. So the one we usually remember is Samuel anoints him. The prophet Samuel anoints him while Saul is still king. But God has rejected Saul, and he's chosen David. Remember, Samuel goes to David's family, his father Jesse, and lines up all the sons, and God keeps telling Samuel, this isn't the one, this isn't the one. And it goes through all the boys, and finally Samuel says, is there any others? Oh yeah, there's a little boy that's out shepherding the sheep. And so David's brought in, and he's anointed at that time to be the next king. But also in this book, in 2 Samuel, if you go back chapter 2, the men of Judah anoint David as their king. So Judah being the southern part of the country, they anoint David as king in chapter 2. And now it says the men of Israel come, so the people from the northern part, they come and anoint David. So 3 times David is anointed as king. I don't know if he got tired of it, second or third time, but how many times do you have to be anointed before you're king? At least 3, apparently. But the first time, it was back in 1 Samuel 16. It was in private by Samuel, and then by the men of Judah in chapter 2, and now in public here by the elders of Israel. How old is David when he becomes king, according to what we read? Well, he's 30, all right? 30 years old. Seems to be a momentous time for a lot of people in the Bible. So if you go read the old law, for instance, priests, when they were anointed to become priests, the law said they were to be 30. Numbers chapter 4, I think, is a place where that part of the law is. And then what famous son of David is 30 when he starts his public work? More famous even than Solomon. Who was called son of David? Yeah. So if you go into the New Testament to Jesus in Luke chapter 3, verse 23, when he begins his public ministry, Luke says he was about 30 years old. And just seems to be an important age in biblical reckoning. David, how long is he king, according to what we read? 40 years, right? And it even gives us some specifics, how long he was king at Hebron, which is, we're going to get the switch of places where he reigns here in this chapter, but at Hebron for 7.5 years. Hebron is more in the south. So when he's reigning over Judah, that group, he reigns for 7.5 years there. And then when the capital becomes Jerusalem, when all of Israel is united under his leadership, it says here that he reigns there 33 years. So that gives you your 40. Jerusalem, why the switch, from Hebron to Jerusalem? Well, it's more, Jerusalem puts you more in the middle of things. If you look at the geography of Israel, north to south, Jerusalem sort of more in the middle. It's not, and it's not owned by either the North Israel or Judah. In fact, as we'll see, it's never been conquered up until this time. So no tribe owns it. No tribe of Israel owns it. So it's sort of like this neutral place, this new place. So you got a new king and trying to unite all the nation. It's a good place. It's sort of like, I guess, almost how we think of D.C. Not part of any state. And that was part of the wisdom of choosing that at the time. And it was, at the time, when D.C. was chosen, it was sort of central to everything, right? So Jerusalem is like that as well. And as far as Jerusalem itself, and it got a little picture there of a little line drawing of David's city, which was pretty small. Okay, when we think of Jerusalem now, or in the Bible times, you have to go way up this hill, because the city eventually spreads and the temple is built up on top. This is just down the hill from it was David's city, the original city that became the capital. But anyway, do you remember in our study over a couple of years here, where do we first encounter Jerusalem in the biblical story? Where do we first? Melchizedek. Where is that? Who runs into Melchizedek? Yeah, way back in Genesis, right? Abraham, and there it's not even called Jerusalem, it's called Salem. And that's clear back Genesis 13 or 14, where Abraham comes across this priest of Salem named Melchizedek, this mysterious Melchizedek that we only get a couple of verses about. And until the New Testament book of Hebrews, where we get all these verses about Melchizedek, the Hebrew writer used that as to teach what he was teaching. But anyway, that's the first place, Genesis 14. And then later, when we get to, when Israel invades Canaan, the land of Canaan starts conquering territory, they come to Jerusalem, but they aren't able to take it. Joshua's not able to take it. And so there remains this group, non-Israelite group, in charge of the city until the time of David, called the Jebusites. The Jebusites live there. And whenever Jerusalem is referred to then, up until this time, it talks about, sometimes it's called Jebus. And so the people that live there are the Jebusites. All right? And that's who's there when David takes it here, makes it the capital, and becomes known as the city of David. But that's the next little part here. It tells us how they took it. So beginning in verse 6, the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, "You will not come in here." We get a little trash talk back and forth here. Ancient world trash talk. "You will not come in here," the Jebusites say to David, "but the blind and the lame will ward you off." And if you could see the geography of where they were, there's a reason that their trash talk is. It was pretty impregnable. I mean, it's sort of built. I was trying to think of a parallel around here. I don't know if Mount Pleasant's a good, maybe it is sort of, if you had a fortress up there and you thought of trying to take that without modern military equipment, to have to scale that. I mean, that's sort of like what the place where the Jebusite city was very hard to get to. Walls around it and cliffs up to it and so forth. So they think, no one else has been able to take it. This little band that David has, they're not taking. The blind and the lame could hold you off, right? And they just think David cannot come in here. But verse 7, nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion. This is the first place it's called Zion. That is the city of David. And David said on that day, whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind. You see they're back and forth. They said, the blind and the lame will hold you off. And David said, you get up there and take the lame and the blind. Whoever can get up the water shaft can take it. The lame and the blind who are hated by David's soul. I don't think that means that David hated lame or blind people. He's talking about, he's using their language, you see. Therefore it said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house. And David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built the city all around from the Millo inward. So how do they take the city? So you got this place that's built on this ridge with, it's hard to approach, well defended. It has a water source. And apparently there is a channel that goes under the city wall, right? There's a spring down at the bottom of the hill called the Gihon Spring. We know that. And they've found channels cut in the rock, the bedrock, that go from the spring up into this area. In fact, archaeologists found towers that were built in the city wall that accessed the water source. So you see, you're sort of sneaking in, and David somehow knows about it. He's got his intelligence agents informing him, and he says, whoever can get up there, okay, that'll work. You can go read the parallel account of this in Chronicles. It gives a little bit more detail. We're told who the guy is who goes up and gets it. In fact, we find out that it's this Joab. He scales it, and they get into the city and break its defenses and so forth. So this is sort of a very shorthand account of how it happened, but this is how they access it. And now it becomes the city of David, and it begins to be built from that place. Questions or comments so far on anything? Bill?
That's a fantastic thing about our water supply. Simply fantastic.
Yeah. That, and very important in that world. You don't build someplace where you have no water, right? We don't think about it. It's, somebody else takes care of that. Like, we pay a bill and somebody else takes care of supplying the water for us. I learned this summer. So when we moved here, the first time we'd ever had a well. All right, we'd always been on city water. It's the first time we had a well. I didn't realize that when the power goes out, that the water doesn't come. It shows how swift I am. But you sort of take for granted until it happens, and so, but also that meant, in that world, it meant if you could figure out where the water come in, that's a potential weakness, right? And later on, let's see, in Daniel, when Babylon is attacked, they come in under the walls by the river that comes under. Okay, that's the way those who conquered Babylon came in. So place of weakness. I mean, we don't think about that today either, because now if you're attacking a city, you lob bombs over, right? But in that world, you had to find a way to get in the walls, the defensive walls. Yeah. Yeah, this will come in later too, like in Israel's later history during the time of Hezekiah, when Assyria is besieging Jerusalem. So the armies come and surround the city, and what you do in that world is you surround the city, cut off all getting in and getting out, and you starve them. You weaken them that way. That's how you did warfare. And in Hezekiah's day, they needed water during that siege, and they started digging a tunnel, an extra tunnel for water. And you can imagine doing this in the ancient world with no modern, all you got is, picks and so forth. And they're sort of trying to make a connection. And they do. And that's one way they're able to survive that siege. One of the amazing finds of archaeology is they found an inscription in that tunnel where they wrote and described how when they're digging toward each other from two different directions, the workers, and how they started to hear the picks in the bedrock, and that's how they were finding each other. And if you can go to Israel today and walk that Hezekiah's tunnel, they call it, and it's not exactly like perfectly straight, but they're sort of working through it, sort of like our roads, But they found that inscription when they dug that tunnel. Todd? Yes.
I'm a little claustrophobic anyway, so so you almost have to become blind and lame. You can't walk, you have to crawl in the dark to get into the city. So it helps you on how to.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah. That they gave him a hint for it, but no doubt was a great, right. It was a great feat. They have found their shafts. So you think the city way up here and the spring is way down here. They found the shaft that was dug. It goes this way a certain amount, and then it goes up. And I think this part that goes up into the city is 75 to 100 feet. So they think that's at least how much they had to scale. Joab had to scale to get up in there. Then you imagine once he found the pathway, then the other soldiers come, right? The special forces come and go up in, and then they're in the city. They don't let you climb in that today if you go to Israel, but that one's archaeologists have done that one, but they don't let regular folk do that. But it's sort of amazing how it was conquered. But it's not a big area. So, and we're not talking about 30,000 people that live here. And it's a small group, and then David expands it once it's conquered, and it gradually grows. All right. So you have this feat, and as we've seen, Joab becomes really important to David. He's like, because he's the one who does this, and then Joab becomes his right-hand man and so forth. But to me, verse 10 is like, if I had to underline one verse in this chapter, that to me is the key verse. David became greater and greater. But why? For the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. So, God is blessing David, and he's chosen David. He's going to do his work through David. And God is blessing him with victory and so forth. I think that's really important, because we start reading on and we see he's not this great guy all the time, right? So, verse 11. And Hiram, king of Tyre is a city way up on the Mediterranean coast, big important city. Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David and cedar trees, also carpenters and masons, sent a few of me, who built David a house. And David knew that the Lord had established him king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. Obviously, we don't know how long all this is, but it's sort of a summary of events, right? So it's once David becomes king over all Israel, other kings, nations start sending emissaries, and Hiram, king of Tyre, is one. And Hiram builds David his palace. I don't know how long that took, or how many years we're talking about, that David has a palace here in the city of David. And it's built by a foreign king. Hiram will also work with Solomon, David's son, in the building of the temple later, as we keep on reading. In verse 13, David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem after he came from Hebron. And more sons and daughters were born to David. These are the names of those who were born to him in Jerusalem. Here's your favorite part of the chapter, Steve, the names, right? Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Eliada, Eliphelet. If in doubt, pronounce it quickly. Two names more prominent than the others there, Nathan and Solomon. Solomon because, he becomes the king after David. Nathan, does anybody know why that name is important later on in the Bible? It's not the famous Nathan the prophet who confronts David on his sin, but this person is mentioned in Jesus' genealogy. So if you go read in Luke chapter 3, Nathan's name appears as it lists the ancestors of Jesus. Nathan is a child born to David from Bathsheba. Okay. But, David keeps marrying and taking concubines. Concubines sort of like less official wives that he has children with who can't become part of the, can't become king. The concubines' wives don't become king, but this is all politics. And why is he marrying all these people? It's what kings do in the ancient world. If you want to, it's a way to make a treaty. So you marry, and if you've studied the history of England, a lot of times the English kings did things like this. Married a wife from the King of France or whatever, prevents wars. This is going on. David's doing this. He's not doing it in consultation with God. This is David being a politician. He's probably being advised to do it. And, the writer doesn't stop to say David shouldn't have done this, but All you have to do is read the law, and it says don't do this. If you want a specific reference, Deuteronomy 17:17, kings are forbidden to acquire many wives. Okay? They're not supposed to do this, but they do it. So if you count them all up for David, it's sort of hard to get an exact number, but it seems he ends up with somewhere between 15 and 20 wives, concubines. All right? An example which his son Solomon really followed. Because Solomon, if you add up his wives and concubines, you got about 1,000. 1,000. 300 wives, 700 concubines. Or as one of the girls said when we were teaching them, 700 porcupines, which is probably more accurate. And, it was a huge problem for Solomon because the Bible specifically says these led him away from God. And in the law there in Deuteronomy where it says kings should not do this, it says lest these foreign wives lead you away from the Lord. That was the warning. But it's an example of where David, yes, man after God's own heart, God is working through him, but he is not always following God's will for his life. And all these wives and children by them ends up in disastrous results. So I don't know how far we go in this particular lesson series in Samuel, but if you go on just 5 or 6 chapters, the disasters start piling up. So basically in chapters 13 through 19 of this book, you have issues with Amnon, one of the sons from one of these wives, who rapes his sister. All right, and there's a big problem there. And then Absalom, another of the sons, who leads a rebellion and actually kicks David out of Jerusalem for a period of time, takes over. So it's just issue after issue that comes from this eventually. And there's a reason God advised against it. All right. Questions, comments so far? Any more? Last little part here is some of the early wars. On the back of the sheet I gave you, it has a little diagram of David's conquests, and it lists the wars here. The first 3 that are listed in the list of 8 are in this chapter. So you have the conquering of Jerusalem, and then the battles with the Philistines that end the chapter. So beginning in verse 17, when the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, all the Philistines went up to search for David. David heard of it and went down to the stronghold. Now the Philistines had come and spread out in the valley of Rephaim, which is close to Jerusalem. And David inquired of the Lord. Now here we see the good side of David, right? It's sort of like this with him. Right? David stops to ask the Lord, and he is a warrior, right? He is a great warrior, but he stops to ask, should I go out and fight them, Lord? Shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand? The Lord said to him, go, for I will certainly give the Philistines into your hand. And then David came to this place, Baal Perazim, and David defeated them there, and he said, the Lord has burst through my enemies before me like a bursting flood. Therefore the name of that place is called Baal Perazim. And the Philistines left their idols there, and David and his men carried them away. All right, that's battle number 1. Then number 2, the Philistines came up yet again and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. And David, when he inquired of the Lord, so again he asked, should I go? Should I go confront them? And this time the Lord says, don't go up, go around to their rear and come against them opposite the balsam trees. And when you hear the sound of the marching in the tops of the balsam trees, then rouse yourself, for then the Lord has gone out before you to strike down the army of the Philistines. And David did as the Lord commanded him and struck down the Philistines from Geba to Gezer. So, 2 battles against these people of the land called the Philistines. Just in what the little summaries of these accounts here, what do you see as the key in the success? What's the key? The Lord is the key, right? The fact that he consulted, should I go? And one time the advice is, yeah, go right up. The next time God gives him battle advice, no, go around. And in fact, what are they going to hear? We don't know exactly what's going on there, but the image is God's armies are fighting. God's fighting for you, and they defeat them both times. Steve, did you have your hands up? Steve, did you have your hand up? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm seeing things. Secret of the success is God. There's an interesting, it's almost a perfect opposite of this approach. So we have to go all the way back to 1 Samuel chapter 4. This is before there's any king, before Saul. It's when Samuel is leading Israel. If you go read that story in 1 Samuel 4, it's another battle with the Philistines. In fact, I can read it better than I can tell it. For Samuel 4, the word of Samuel came to all Israel. Now Israel went out to battle against the Philistines. And it talks about where Philistines drew up in line against Israel, and when the battle spread, Israel was defeated. So they lose. But you notice in that, there's no talking about, Lord, should we go up, or anything like that. Just they line up in battle, 4,000 men of Israel killed. And when the troops came to the camp, the elders of Israel said, why has the Lord defeated us before the Philistines today? And then they say, none of this, they don't stop and say, they're just asking one another, you see. Why do we get beat? And they say, okay, let's try this again. Let us bring the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord here. That'll get it, if we have the Ark. And it may save us from the power of our enemies. So they brought the Ark. And you know what happened? Beaten again. In fact, the Ark is seized. So they eventually figure it out, but they're beaten in battle twice by the Philistines with never consulting the Lord, and they lose the Ark. In this battle, all these years later, David twice asked the Lord. And another thing that happened, and that's interesting, when they brought the Ark into the camp of Israel, everybody shouted. All the warriors shouted. And the Philistines down in their camp, they're afraid. They're like, oh, a god has entered the camp. So they go to war the next day, and the Philistines still win. All right, see how the parallel is? So now, all these years later with David, twice he asks God, should I go? And God says, yes. In fact, you're going to hear the sound of me in the trees. And they win both times, and they take the idols of the Philistines, right? Just like the Philistines all those years before had taken the Ark. So it's almost like a perfect opposite that happens here. in the time of David. And it's one of his early victories. And there are several of them as he expands his power throughout Israel. And the coming chapters will outline those. All right? We are out of time.